Thank you everyone for joining today's press conference on Transport Day. I will hand over to the COP President Alok Sharma for some opening remarks, and then to the high-level champion Nigel Topping for some follow-up remarks. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you're aware, the first draft of the cover decision text were published this morning, and earlier this afternoon I hosted a stock-taking plenary which the ministers that I've requested to co-facilitate negotiations on some of those key outstanding issues presented their views on progress. The science and citizens across the world demand that we are unapologetically high ambition as a presidency, and the cover decision texts are, in our view, high ambition and, importantly, balanced. Of course, texts will change and evolve as countries begin to engage on the details, but our shared commitment to accelerate action this decade must be unwavering. And science must be our compass, and this should spur us towards consensus. I also want to be clear, we are not seeking to reopen the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement clearly sets out the temperature goal, well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees. That is why our overarching goal of keeping 1.5 degrees within reach has been our lodestar. We seek to chart a path that is balanced across the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement: finance, adaptation, and mitigation. I will continue to champion finance, as I have done throughout my time in this role, and I've asked developed countries to be flexible in their positions. The task of finalizing all texts, including the cover decisions, will be challenging. But we all know what is at risk if we do not reach an ambitious outcome. Climate-vulnerable countries on the front line of the climate crisis will continue to bear the brunt before it engulfs us all. The text on adaptation aims to build our shared capacity to act. Climate change is affecting all of us. Needs are growing and we must respond. We've also included a section on loss and damage. This is a first for this process, and I hope that countries will engage constructively. Discussions on the Santiago network in Glasgow suggest that parties will engage in the right spirit. On mitigation, we know that we've made progress on the journey to Glasgow, but the science shows that we can and must go further. The text gives countries the opportunity to agree how they will accelerate action and return to the table with stronger commitments. In addition to the cover decision, texts are still evolving on the rulebook items and finance. On Article 6, the text has narrowed and the choices are clear. It will be a matter of political will now to close this outcome. On transparency, negotiators are moving through the technical work. Transparency underpins the Paris Agreement and is absolutely crucial to delivering on our commitments. On common timeframes, we are down to 2 options. On finance, there remains a lot of work to do, but we have seen some positive announcements, such as the £350 million in contributions to the Adaptation Fund and the $350 million in contributions to the Adaptation Fund and $413 million to the LDC Fund. I hope this supports a good atmosphere in negotiations. Let me talk a little bit about the process going forward. My lead negotiator, Archie Young, will convene a heads of delegations meeting this afternoon to take stock of parties' detailed views on draft cover decision texts. My team and I then intend to review progress across all issues from 7 p.m. this evening. I will meet with co-facilitating ministers before ministerial and technical co-facilitators publish what I expect to be near final texts overnight. I will then convene all groups, parties and observers again at 11 a.m. tomorrow in plenary to hear views. As a presidency, we are fully committed to transparency and openness, and I have invited parties to reach out to me if they wish to meet outside the formal sessions. As I told the plenary earlier, we have seen a spirit of cooperation and consensus at the summit thus far. It is a can-do spirit that I hope all parties will want to continue to foster over the coming critical days. I still have the intention for us to be able to close Cop26 at the end of Friday. Everyone must come armed with the currency of compromise. We all know what is at stake in these negotiations and indeed the urgency of our tasks. In very human terms, what we agree in Glasgow will set the future for our children and grandchildren. And I know that no world leader or country will want to fail them. Back to you, Lynn.
Nigel?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As you know, today is Transport Day, so I just thought I'd give you a few highlights of what's been happening outside the negotiations. First of all, a lot of momentum on the accelerated transition to zero-emission vehicles. We're seeing a huge acceleration anyway. The number of zero-emission vehicles on the road has more than doubled in the last 2 years, and now over 30% of the global market is covered by manufacturers who are committed to phase out fossil fuel vehicles by 2040 or earlier. At the beginning of the year, I think you could only say that of Tesla and Mercedes, so a big increase. And we now have analysts doubling their forecast for zero-emission vehicle sales by 2040 over the last 5 years, now predicting 70%. I predict that they'll increase their forecasts again in the next few years because they've always increased them upwards. But most importantly today, we're seeing a really strong consensus, stronger than ever before, on the pace of the transition needed to meet the Paris Agreement goals. We've now got, we often talk about this systemic transformation. We now have countries, cities, states, vehicle manufacturers, fleet owners and investors, so all parts of the value chain and regulatory environment from all over the world aligning to the goal of making all new car sales zero emissions by 2040 globally and by 2035 in leading markets. And that collaboration is strengthening. The major markets met today in the ZEV Transition Council to discuss supporting developing countries in this transition, and a new World Bank Trust Fund is being launched for this purpose. But there are other parts of the transport sector. In shipping, a lot of progress today. 19 countries have signed up to work together with industry leaders to develop the world's first green shipping corridors in the so-called Clydebank declarations. And over 200 businesses from across the entire value chain, shipping value chain, have committed to scaling and commercializing zero-emissions shipping vessels and fuels by 2030. And then on the demand side, big-name brands, including Amazon, IKEA, Michelin, Unilever, Patagonia, and many others, have announced that they will only buy 100% zero-carbon freight services from 2040. A very strong market signal there. In aviation, 18 aviation industry businesses and large corporate customers are now aiming to boost the sustainable aviation fuel in the mix to 10% by 2030. Last year, the mix was 0.01%, so that's a 1,000-fold increase, which itself would save 60 million tons of CO2 per year and provide 300,000 green jobs, and crucially, get the cost of sustainable aviation fuel down so that percentage can continue to grow exponentially in the decade that follows. You'll have seen previous announcements from IATA, the industry committing to net zero aviation by 2050, and today 14 countries have agreed to work for a new ambitious target within the International Civil Aviation Organization. Finally, we started by talking about cars, but a lot of momentum to buses, looking to phase out diesel buses as early as 2030. Of course, many cities and companies have already made that decision, and heavy goods vehicles by 2040. All of this, I think, is evidence of what you've heard me describe as the ambition loop, with the breakthrough agenda announced at the World Leaders Summit, with countries committing to making the clean technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible, and attractive in each emitting sector by the end of the decade. And that parallels the non-state actor 2030 breakthroughs work, which the COP president launched back in January, and where we've seen a lot of momentum from non-state actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. We'll now take some questions from the floor. As ever, we have a standing microphone. If you can try not to touch it as it's being passed between you all, someone will put it in front of you. Gentleman in the front here, please.
Thank you. Adam Vaughan for New Scientist. Alok, we've seen some pushback today on the language in the cover text, on the language of urges for coming back with better climate plans next year from some countries and NGOs. I just wondered, if the language stays as it is, will you be able to credibly claim at the end of COP26 that Glasgow has kept 1.5 degrees alive, which is your stated aim?
Well, our ambition remains undiminished. We've always been consistent that we do want to get to the point at the end of Glasgow where we can say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 within reach. As I explained, we are starting discussions on the first draft of the cover text. Let's see what comes out of that. But I am very unapologetic in the fact that we are looking for an ambitious outcome, and that is a consistent message that I'm delivering to all parties.
Next. Gentleman in the front here.
Thank you very much. It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about declaration of zero-emission cars. There are Nissan and Toyota in the UK. They have a factory, but Honda get out because one of the reasons is Brexit, I think. But yesterday's declarations, we cannot find the name of Toyota, Nissan, and Japanese government in declaration. Why do you think they don't join the declaration?
Well, obviously, you'd have to ask them why they didn't join. I think what we're seeing today is a significant systemic shift. Not every country and not every company has signed up, but you'll know, for example, that the European Commission has advised the EU for a 2035 phase-out date, that California, which makes the market in many ways, has a similar date, and that both China and the US, which are the other two big markets that drive the global kind of regulatory demands, have big 2025 and 2030 targets, which are in line. The other thing I should say is that we have over 1,000 cities in the race to zero, and many of those with net zero targets earlier than 2050, often driven by air quality concerns, so very keen to accelerate the shift to electric vehicles. And so, although there's a much smaller number of cities signed this declaration, I think if given time, you might find that nearly all of those 1,000, and many of those 1,000 are in Japan. So our sense is that this is a whole market shift, and those companies that haven't yet made that commitment for whatever reason will not be able to buck the market. They'll have to meet the overall trend of the end of the combustion engine in the mid-30s.
Lady in the front here.
Thanks. Emily Beeman from PA. What sense are you getting from countries about where the really difficult issues are going to be in agreeing the cover decision? And do you think that the language on coal and fossil fuel subsidies is going to survive to the final text? Thank you.
So we had an informal plenary this morning, or earlier this afternoon, if I can say. I think there were a range of views that were expressed by different groups. I think there were certain elements of the cover decision that were welcomed. There were other elements of the cover decision which various parties raised concerns about. And I think we had a whole range of views that were expressed. What Archie, and I'll invite him if he wants to come in next, what Archie will be doing is going through the detailed feedback from parties this afternoon, and then we will have to reflect. But you know, we set the text was put together on the basis of what we heard from parties in the first place. You know, on previous days we've talked about the non-paper that was put forward, and we have reflected the views of parties in this. I mean, let's see where we get to, but I want to continue to be high ambition. And I would just say one other point is that, you know, as asked about, you know, whether we are still pushing for keeping 1.5 alive, I would just say to all colleagues, please think back to what Mia Mottley said at the World Leaders Summit, where she made the point that 2 degrees for her country and many other island states was going to be a death sentence. That's why it's important and vital that we work to keep 1.5 within reach. Archie, do you want to?
Thank you. I'd echo what the COP president has said in terms of the collaborative way that we have developed the text. I would also highlight that, as you will have seen, there are several placeholders which are there because there are ongoing negotiations which are through both the technical and the ministerial tracks. And we need to see those mature and develop before those can then be brought into the text. I think when they do, that will help with the overall balance. That will also help with giving more meat to the direction on each of the issues as outlined. Thank you.
Thanks. Lady on the right here.
Thank you. Hannah Thomas-Peter from Sky News. Mr. Sharma, if I may. Saudi Arabia has been accused of trying to derail the summit because it's so opposed to so many of the elements in the cover text. You have just met with the energy minister. Is it your view that Saudi Arabia is still trying to derail the summit, and what happened in that meeting?
Well, so I've been asked my views on individual countries over the course of all of these press conferences. And you'll forgive me if I give the same consistent message, which is that I'm not going to give a running commentary on conversations that I'm having with individual parties or indeed negotiating groups as well. My job is to build consensus. My job is to deliver a consistent message on what we're trying to achieve. And as I said, my message to absolutely every single party here and every negotiating group is the same, is that we are looking for a high ambition outcome in Glasgow. And the reason for that is what the world demands, and that is what all of our individual peoples demand.
For ease, the gentleman behind with the red tie.
Thank you. Francisco Camacho, The Daily Times. I recognize, as you said, Mr. Sharma, that your official position remains that 1.5 is within reach. But I just talked this afternoon with a professor at Queen's University Belfast who specializes in the green political economy, and he and many others are saying that this is confirming that 1.5 is dead. And I know it's not lost on anyone here what that means for many of the frontline regions of the world, like my familial home in Micronesia, where my 12-year-old cousin still lives. So my questions then are twofold. First, what action do you expect to be produced from what you claim to be a very high ambition cover draft? And second, what would you say to my 12-year-old cousin CJ and people like her who live in these areas that, as you have said, will bear the brunt of climate change?
Yes, thank you for that. Look, my message to your cousin, CJ, and indeed to anyone living at the front line of climate change is that we are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that we have an ambitious outcome. And I have reminded ministers and negotiators this afternoon that world leaders came, they set out their words in terms of the ambition they wanted to see. We now need to translate that into commitment and action. And that's what these next few days are about. And frankly, if we're not able to do that, then ministers, negotiators, world leaders are going to have to look in the eye, people in their countries and other countries, and explain why we did not get this one over the line. In terms of your specific issue of how we are able to get more ambition, I think if you look at the details of the draft of the cover text, it makes references to countries coming back ahead of the stocktake. It makes references to census reports being on an annual basis. So there is a clear, if I can put it like this, green thread throughout these cover decisions texts, which sets out how that additional ambition is going to have to come forward. I mean, if Archie wants to say any more, you're very welcome, Archie.
Thank you. I would just add that in addition to that language and the ambition on reducing emissions, it's important to note the ambition on scaling up adaptation and also on finance, referencing the efforts that have already been made, also recognizing with regret where that has fallen short, and really setting the direction in terms of scaling up both action and finance for adaptation, also scaling up the political priority and imperative as well as action on loss and damage, and also enabling all of the financial flows, both public and private, to enable the transition. Thank you.
Gentleman in the second row here, in the centre.
James Murray from Business Green. One of the other reported key sticking points is around climate finance and loss and damage and adaptation all going forward. To President Sharma, how will you convince your colleagues in government that more money is needed, both now and from 2025, to secure a deal here and get poorer and developing countries on board and give them the climate justice they're asking for?
Yes, I think what I would say more generally is that obviously we set out the delivery plan, which was put together by Jochen Flashbart and Jonathan Wilkinson, and there have been further announcements here in terms of additional funds. I also set out today where we've got to in terms of the adaptation fund and also the LDC fund. There is no doubt a real ask from developing nations, from climate vulnerable nations, for more to be done on adaptation. And I can tell you that we are pushing very hard to see whether there is something that can be delivered in terms of rebalancing between adaptation and mitigation finance. And the second issue I think that has come up consistently has been about access to finance as well. And a few days ago, I set out the plans that have come out of the task force for access to finance, where 5 pilot projects are being launched in countries around the world so that we can support the access to finance issue and ensure that we are finding solutions to that as well.
Would you like to add any more, Archie? Okay, gentleman in the centre, in the black.
George Kozhevnikov, reporter for Russian magazine called Plus One. Russian delegation has a lot of representatives at this COP. However, all of them were unable to answer any of our questions during the last 10 days. So it's really hard to understand the level of their involvement into negotiations. Now, you just said that you don't comment on activity of delegations, so I don't expect you to get into any insights about engagement of Russia. But how do you suggest that we Russian journalists do our work?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite got that. So in terms of your work as a journalist?
Yeah, because we can't report to Russian people on what we do in this summit because our delegation don't provide us with any information and you don't comment on their activity also.
Well, obviously, what, from a presidency point of view, we are not able to do is require delegations to speak to journalists. You will appreciate that. What I can tell you is that we are holding these daily press conferences, and throughout this whole process of when we took on COP26, we have been open, we've been transparent, and I hope that is reflected from the parties as well. And we will continue to hold these press conferences. There are a whole range of events that you will all have been to as well, and I'm sure there are a range of colleagues and parties who would be very happy to speak to you about their views on what's going on here in Glasgow.
Gentleman in the second row here.
Another question for you, President. Alistair Thompson from Scoop Media in New Zealand. The question is another one on finance, and it relates to the private sector finance and the ideas about first loss capital, which seem to be being explored. Is it likely that that will in fact be included in texts in a constructive way to start private finance flowing as quickly as possible?
I think what I'm not going to do is sort of comment on developing text. I mean, Archie's welcome if he wants to get into the detail of that. I mean, I know the first loss issue is something that has been more widely discussed as well outside this COP, and I know that's a particular ask from some of the private sector. I mean, I think there is a wider issue on that in terms of the multilateral agencies that are out there in terms of how they might support such instruments. But as I said, I think from a COP perspective, this has not been a particular focus.
Archie, do you want to add? No, it's fine. Lady on the right-hand side here, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Daniela Chiaretis, Valor Econômico, São Paulo, Brazil. 2 questions, please. One is on Article 6, if you can say if there is any positive movement on that. And second question is about the other crisis we are experiencing, which is the COVID crisis. And I would like to know if you can tell us how many cases of COVID we have inside here.
On Article 6, I mean, if Archie wants to come in on this again, I think we're probably restricted on what we can say. But on the issue of COVID, I've been asked about this before, and obviously the numbers are with the health authorities in Scotland and ultimately belong to them, and therefore we can't set those out. What I can tell you, and I think we had some colleagues from the Scottish health system who did sort of comment on this in the media yesterday and made the point that rates are extremely low. As I said in previous press conferences, there is no particular cause for concern at all. We are not complacent, but I do think in that respect we are doing well.
Thank you. On Article 6, as you know, we have asked Minister Fu from Singapore and Minister Ida from Norway to consult with parties and facilitate discussions in order to find resolution. From their latest update, it appears that the 3 main issues that were identified before in terms of the corresponding adjustments on the 6.4 mechanism, the accounting that would take place, also the transition of pre-2020 units into the new Sustainable Development Mechanism, and also the question of share of proceeds from transfers through Article 6.2, the international cooperation, that those remain the 3 main sticking issues. We are encouraged that parties continue to engage on those issues, and we have heard a number of bridging solutions being put forward. It remains to be seen how parties are responding to those, and whether which of those, and whether they will be able to reach resolution. I should also say that work is continuing on technical tracks as well, on the clean development mechanism, and also on the work on Article 6.8, non-market frameworks, which is an essential part of Article 6, and that work continues as well. Thank you.
We're out of time, I'm afraid now. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you.